What if the most dangerous criminal in Britain became its most valuable asset? A man whose photograph decorated every police station wall. A safecracker so notorious that Scotland Yard created an entire task force just to hunt him down. Yet somehow, this same individual would earn the highest military honor from the regime he was secretly betraying. 2 parachute drops into enemy territory. 2 nations believing he worked for them alone. One impossible balancing act that would help determine the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. But here's what makes this story truly unsettling. The line between criminal and hero isn't where you'd expect it to be. Because when someone lives their entire life in shadows, how can we ever be certain which side they were really on? The documents released decades later paint a picture so extraordinary that fiction couldn't contain it. A web of deception so intricate that even today, historians debate whether they've uncovered the complete truth. This is the story of a man who made lying an art form, betrayal a profession, and loyalty something far more complex than anyone imagined. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Edward Arnold Chapman entered the world in November of 1914, 4 months into a war that would reshape everything. Northeast England, a mining village called Burnupfield. Poverty wasn't just their neighbor, it lived in their house. His father vanished for months at a time, working as a marine engineer when sober enough to hold a job. When he was home, the local pub saw more of his earnings than his family ever did. 3 children, an absent father, and a mother slowly succumbing to an illness that would claim her life before Edward reached 20. Teachers described him with words that would prove prophetic. Intelligent, yes, but lazy, insolent, easily bored. He collected discarded bottles from beaches, selling them for cinema tickets. Even then, he understood that survival meant finding angles others missed. At 17, Edward Chapman forged his father's signature and lied about his age to join the prestigious Coldstream Guards. For a brief moment, it seemed the military might straighten his path. They even assigned him to guard the crown jewels, a detail that carries bitter irony when you know what came next. But discipline and Edward Chapman mixed like oil and water. By the end of 1933, he was discharged in disgrace. His brother claimed it involved a pregnant girl and a dramatic escape from military detention. Whether true or not, the story fit the pattern emerging around Edward's life. Then came the blow that would push him over the edge entirely. His mother's passing in 1933 from tuberculosis left him completely untethered. The one person who might have anchored him to respectability was gone. London beckoned like a siren song, and Edward Chapman answered its call. Soho in the 1930s pulsed with a kind of desperate energy. Jazz spilled from basement clubs, shadows concealed transactions that daylight couldn't witness, and young men with quick hands and quicker wits found opportunities that legitimate society would never offer. Edward Chapman fit into this world like he'd been born for it. Check fraud, theft, housebreaking, he assembled a criminal resume with the dedication other men brought to building careers. He worked as a barman, which provided perfect cover for cultivating the connections that would define his future. In early 1936, he married Vera Friedberg after knowing her just 3 weeks. Romance had nothing to do with it. The arrangement helped her secure British citizenship while giving Edward a veneer of respectability he desperately needed. But it was his meeting with Jimmy Hunt in jail during 1937 that would transform Edward from small-time criminal to public enemy. Hunt introduced him to the art of safecracking, though art might be too generous a term for their methods. They called themselves the Jelly Gang, and their approach was as subtle as their name suggested. gelignite explosives applied liberally to safes in cinemas, cooperative stores, and dance halls. Loud, messy, but remarkably effective when executed properly. By 1939, Edward Chapman had achieved a strange kind of fame. Newspaper headlines tracked his crimes with the enthusiasm usually reserved for sporting events. Scotland Yard created a dedicated task force just to hunt down the Jelly Gang. But fame brought attention, and attention brought heat. The Metropolitan Police were closing in, their net tightening with each botched job, each witness statement, each photograph circulated to every station in Britain. The gang needed distance. Scotland seemed far enough, until a bungled burglary in Edinburgh landed them all in cells. Edward used a false name, secured bail, then promptly disappeared the moment he was released. One final job in Bournemouth netted them nearly £500 a fortune in 1939. But Edward could feel the walls closing in. Every police bulletin carried his photograph. Every newspaper painted him as Britain's most wanted. He needed an escape route. The Channel Islands offered possibilities, Jersey as a stepping stone, then Monte Carlo, perhaps South America. Anywhere but Britain, where his face was becoming too recognizable for comfort. What Edward Chapman couldn't know was that this attempt at escape would drag him into something far more dangerous than any crime he'd ever contemplated. Jersey should have been freedom. Edward arrived with Betty Farmer, a woman blissfully unaware of his criminal past or his other romantic entanglements. They checked into the luxurious Hotel de la Plage, spending money like it would never run out. For a week, they lived the fantasy Edward had always imagined wealth could buy. Fine dining, expensive wines, the kind of lifestyle that made his criminal efforts feel worthwhile. But fantasies built on stolen money rarely endure. The trap had already been set, though Edward didn't realize it yet. A letter from one of his accomplices, intercepted by police. His location carefully tracked. His freedom measured in days rather than years. During dinner at the hotel, Edward spotted men who looked wrong, too alert, too interested in their surroundings. Plainclothes officers, almost certainly. He fled into the night, abandoning Betty without explanation, leaving her to wonder what had just shattered their perfect week. Now truly desperate, Edward broke into the West Park Pavilion nightclub, stealing enough to pay for passage off the island. He spent the night at a seedy boarding house, but his notoriety had preceded him even there. The landlady recognized his face from morning newspapers and promptly contacted authorities. Edward Chapman woke to find policemen at the foot of his bed. This time, there would be no bail, no convenient disappearance. He pleaded guilty to larceny and housebreaking, receiving a 2-year sentence with hard labor. He might have considered himself fortunate the sentence was far lighter than what awaited him on the mainland for his numerous other crimes. But as 1939 faded into 1940, Edward sat in his Jersey cell watching through barred windows as war consumed Europe. At first, he assumed he would simply serve his time and return to England once the fighting ended. But history had other plans, and Edward Chapman was about to discover that sometimes the most unexpected opportunities arise from the deepest desperation. On June 30th, 1940, the unthinkable occurred. German forces landed on Jersey, making it the only part of the British Isles to fall under foreign occupation during World War II. Suddenly, Edward Chapman wasn't just a British criminal serving time. He was a British citizen in enemy hands, and the rules of survival were about to change completely. Prison life under German occupation carried different rhythms than British incarceration. Edward Chapman adapted, as he always had, learning French from fellow prisoners and carefully observing his new captors. but his criminal mind was already working on possibilities others couldn't see. Anthony Faramus, a fellow prisoner, became his closest confidant during this period. Together, they watched as the grim reality of foreign occupation settled over Jersey like fog. But where others saw only captivity, Edward began formulating something far more audacious. In the winter of 1941, Edward Chapman composed a letter that would change the trajectory of his life forever. Written to German authorities, it offered his services as a saboteur and spy against Britain. His motivations were crystalline: freedom from his cell and revenge against the system that had caged him. When the letter received no response, Edward took direct action that revealed both his desperation and his cunning. He walked straight to the German commander's office and requested a meeting. When the sentry questioned his purpose, Edward boldly declared it was Geheim secret. The German commander initially regarded this unexpected volunteer with suspicion. British citizens offering to spy for Germany were either genuine traitors or elaborate traps. But Edward came prepared, presenting newspaper clippings documenting his criminal career as credentials. The timing proved fortuitous. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr had been tasked with establishing spy networks in Britain, supporting the planned invasion known as Operation Sea Lion. Edward's criminal skills, particularly his expertise with explosives, suggested possibilities German intelligence couldn't ignore. In late 1941, Edward was transferred to Fort Romainville, a prison camp outside Paris, housing high-value prisoners. There, he faced interrogation by German officers, including members of the dreaded SS. Rather than intimidating him, these sessions seemed to energize Edward. He was back in his element, convincing dangerous people to trust him. The Germans were impressed by his criminal background, seeing in his safe-cracking skills the foundation for sabotage training. But they were testing him too, probing for signs of deception, weakness, or divided loyalty. Edward Chapman passed every test they set for him. In summer 1942, he found himself released from prison and transported to an elegant villa in Nantes. His transformation from prisoner to spy was about to begin in earnest. What happened next would either make him one of Germany's most valuable assets or set him on a collision course with the hangman's noose. The villa in Nantes existed in a surreal bubble where elegance masked deadly purpose. Under Stefan Gruning's command, this facility served as an elite training center for German intelligence operatives. Edward Chapman had entered a world where deception became curriculum and betrayal was taught like mathematics. Dr. Ackman, the meticulous German spy master, became Edward's personal instructor in the dark arts. Days began with explosives training, not the crude gelignite methods of the Jelly Gang, but sophisticated techniques that could cripple enemy infrastructure while appearing accidental. The coal sabotage method particularly impressed Edward. Hollowing out lumps of coal, inserting explosives, then resealing them so perfectly that they would detonate only when fed into factory furnaces or ship boilers. Silent, delayed, devastating. The kind of patient destruction that could paralyze British war production. Afternoons brought communications training. Morse code transmitted swiftly enough to evade British direction-finding vans that prowled London streets. Invisible ink techniques. Message concealment in clothing linings and book spines. The infrastructure of espionage, learned through repetition until it became instinct. Then came parachute training. Edward's first jump left him with a sprained ankle, but by the fifth attempt, he was reveling in the adrenaline rush. The sensation of falling through darkness, trusting equipment and training to deliver him safely to Earth, appealed to his criminal's appetite for risk. As his skills developed, German confidence in Edward grew proportionally. They began discussing his first mission, which they grandly designated Operation Pastorius. From that point forward, Edward Chapman would be known as Agent Fritz, his code name in the German intelligence apparatus. He received papers establishing his alias as Edward Arnold, along with a leather wallet containing £1,000 in crisp Bank of England notes. More money than he had ever possessed legitimately, and proof of how seriously the Germans regarded his potential value. The primary target they selected revealed their strategic priorities: the de Havilland Aircraft Factory in Hatfield, a facility crucial to Britain's production of Mosquito bombers. Edward was equipped with 2 wireless sets, one disguised within an ordinary suitcase, and a backup miniature set hidden in a shaving kit. In December 1942, the moment of truth arrived. Edward Chapman was to parachute into Britain and begin his mission as Germany's newest spy. But what his German handlers didn't know was that Edward had already begun contemplating possibilities they couldn't imagine. The criminal who had spent his life deceiving authority figures was about to attempt the greatest deception of all, convincing 2 enemy intelligence services that he worked exclusively for them. Midnight, December 19th, 42. A Heinkel reconnaissance aircraft waited on a French airfield, engines running, ready to carry Edward Chapman toward his destiny. The insertion did not proceed as planned. Over Cambridge, the dispatcher unceremoniously kicked Edward from the aircraft. For terrifying moments, he became entangled in the hatch mechanism before breaking free and plummeting through pitch-black sky. The landing proved catastrophic. He struck frozen ground with such force that vertebrae in his spine compressed, sending waves of excruciating pain through his body. But Edward Chapman had survived. Gathering his scattered equipment in darkness, the wireless sets, forged papers, explosive materials, he began moving painfully through unfamiliar terrain. Hours passed as he stumbled through hedgerows and across fields, disoriented and increasingly desperate. Dawn brought the silhouette of a farmhouse through early morning mist. As Edward approached, he made the decision that would determine not only his fate, but potentially influence the war's outcome. Rather than proceeding with his German mission, he would surrender to British authorities and offer his services as a double agent. An elderly farmer answered Edward's knock, shotgun in hand, understandably suspicious of strangers appearing before sunrise. Edward claimed to be RAF Flight Lieutenant Edwards, explaining that his plane had crashed nearby and he needed to telephone his base. The farmer reluctantly allowed him to use the telephone, but instead of calling any RAF facility, Edward contacted local police. When authorities arrived, they immediately saw through his thin cover story. His equipment was decidedly non-standard for British airmen, and his offer to work as a double agent met with considerable skepticism. Within hours, Edward found himself in a blacked-out car heading toward London's Latchmere House, which housed an interrogation center codenamed Camp 0020. There he would face Colonel Robin Stevens, known throughout British intelligence circles as Tin Eye, for his monocle and intimidating demeanor. The master interrogator hurled questions at Edward with relentless intensity, probing for inconsistencies, testing his story against known facts, searching for signs of deception or divided loyalty. But Edward handled the barrage with the same skills that had served him in Soho's criminal underworld. He maintained that he had always intended to approach British intelligence as a double agent from the moment he became involved with German espionage. MI5 officers conducted exhaustive background investigations, even tracking down former associates from Edward's criminal days to verify his claims. His offer sparked intense debate among British intelligence officers. His extensive criminal record and admitted life as a scoundrel suggested unreliability to some. Others argued that he should be interned for the war's duration as a security risk. But after conducting several lengthy interrogations, interspersed with sessions where Edward eagerly shared everything he had learned about German intelligence operations, MI5 reached a remarkable conclusion. Edward Chapman was largely telling the truth about his willingness to work against the Germans. The criminal was about to become Britain's most valuable asset in the shadow war of deception and counterintelligence. Camp X, a training facility near Beaulieu in the New Forest, became Edward Chapman's finishing school in the art of sanctioned deception. His criminal background, initially viewed as a liability, proved to be his greatest asset. Years of living outside the law had given him precisely the temperament espionage required. Cool under pressure, resourceful, comfortable with lies that could mean the difference between life and elimination. In January 1943, MI5 officially designated Chapman as Agent Zigzag, a code name that perfectly captured his unpredictable trajectory between German and British intelligence services. He was assigned to Section B1A, led by Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Robertson, the man charged with running the double-cross system. This counterintelligence operation controlled turned German agents, including many who would prove instrumental in Operation Fortitude, the Allies' grand deception scheme regarding the timing and location of the D-Day landings. Edward Chapman was about to join the most sophisticated game of strategic lies ever conceived. The immediate challenge involved Edward's sabotage mission for the Germans. MI5 decided the best approach was to fake an explosion at the de Havilland factory while sending disinformation back to German handlers. This deception operation received the appropriately theatrical designation, Operation Damp Squib. Victor Rothschild, head of MI5's anti-sabotage section and member of the famous banking family, personally oversaw the planning. They needed to create convincing evidence of destruction without actually damaging war production easier envisioned than executed. The solution proved ingenious in its simplicity. A small, controlled explosion would be staged at night when the factory was empty. Photographs of pre-existing damage at another facility would be presented as results of Edward's sabotage. A friendly journalist would be tipped off to ensure the incident made newspapers, providing independent confirmation for German intelligence. Edward himself was sent to Hendon, where he immersed himself in learning minute details of his supposed attack. The exact placement of explosives, the sound and force of detonation, even the lingering smell of cordite. Every detail had to be perfect, because German handlers would test his story with the thoroughness of men whose lives depended on accurate intelligence. But it wasn't all operational preparation for Agent Zigzag. Always escorted by his MI5 shadows, Edward spent considerable time purchasing new clothes at London's finest shops and visiting pubs. His handlers quickly learned that he was a man of expensive tastes, champagne when available, cigars rather than cigarettes, jazz records played on a gramophone he requested for his safe house. When they questioned these luxurious demands, Edward's response revealed both his audacity and his understanding of psychology. If he was to serve king and country, he should be treated like royalty himself. Remarkably, MI5 generally accommodated his requests, recognizing that keeping their most valuable double agent content was worth the expense. As the date approached for Edward's return to German handlers, MI5 carefully prepared him for the dangerous performance ahead. They provided selected military information, genuine but outdated or already known to Germans, to establish his credibility. They rehearsed his cover story repeatedly, testing him with the same aggressive questioning techniques his German contacts would likely employ. When Agent Zigzag departed for Europe, MI5 knew they were taking an enormous gamble. Edward Chapman was no ordinary agent, and the game he was playing carried stakes higher than any criminal endeavor he'd ever attempted. MI5 arranged Edward's return to German contacts via Lisbon, traveling aboard the SS City of Lancaster from Liverpool. The journey itself carried risks. German U-boats prowled Atlantic shipping lanes, and Edward's survival depended on avoiding the very forces he was supposedly serving. In Lisbon, he made contact with German handlers through their legation, handing over carefully prepared intelligence written in secret ink. His report of successfully destroying the de Havilland factory was delivered with the confidence of a man who had genuinely completed his mission. Edward was soon sent back to Paris, where he faced intense interrogation by the Abwehr, including his primary handler, Stefan Gruning. This was the critical test. German intelligence officers probing every detail of his story, searching for inconsistencies that might betray double loyalty. But Edward Chapman was in his element. The same skills that had convinced Soho criminal contacts to trust him with their secrets now served him in far deadlier circumstances. Based on his convincing reports of sabotage, Edward's status within German intelligence was immediately elevated. He became Germany's most successful spy operating against Britain, a distinction that came with remarkable honors. The Germans awarded him the Iron Cross, making him the only British national known to have received this prestigious German military decoration for espionage activities. The irony was exquisite: a British double agent decorated by the very regime he was betraying. It was clear that the Reich trusted their agent Fritz implicitly. They had been completely deceived, which meant Edward's precarious balancing act was working perfectly. But success brought new challenges, including increased scrutiny from both sides. The Germans decided their star agent deserved a well-earned holiday, dispatching him to Norway, where he could rest while meeting with handlers for briefings on future missions. In summer 1943, Edward arrived in Oslo, where fate introduced him to Dagmar Lahlum at the Ritz Hotel. Their romance bloomed amid the surreal normality of wartime Norway, sailing, swimming, making love while the world burned around them. But Dagmar carried secrets of her own, working for the Norwegian resistance movement. Their relationship became an intelligence partnership, with Edward gathering information for Britain while maintaining his cover as a German agent. Edward's enthusiasm for photography provided perfect cover for their activities. While he snapped pictures of his beautiful girlfriend, she posed strategically outside military installations and fortifications. The coincidence was surely innocent, just a man in love documenting time with his paramour. For 11 months, Edward lived this strange double life in Oslo. Agent Zigzag was simultaneously serving three masters: German intelligence, British MI5, and the Norwegian resistance. Each believed they possessed his complete loyalty, and each was partially correct. But all good deceptions must eventually end, and by early 1944, Edward was preparing for his second mission to Britain. The strategic situation had shifted dramatically, and German priorities reflected their growing desperation as the war turned against them. The Reich needed intelligence on why their U-boats were being lost in unprecedented numbers. British anti-submarine capabilities had improved mysteriously, and German naval commanders suspected new radar technologies capable of detecting submarines on the surface during night operations or poor weather. Edward's mission was to investigate these radar systems and gather intelligence on British anti-submarine tactics. But as he prepared to parachute back into England, the tide of World War II was turning decisively against Germany, and his role in the Shadow War was about to become even more crucial. Edward's second departure for England faced multiple delays. Twice his flights from Norway were cancelled, creating dangerous gaps in his communication with German handlers. During this period, the war's trajectory shifted fundamentally, with the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. D-Day changed everything, including Edward Chapman's mission parameters. Just days after the invasion began, Germany launched their desperate counterattack, pilotless jet-powered flying bombs known as V-1s, aimed at London's civilian population. These buzz bombs, or doodlebugs, represented Hitler's secret weapon, a final gambit at staving off inevitable defeat. Edward's mission was redirected toward providing intelligence on the effectiveness of these new long-range weapons. Were they hitting their intended targets in London's heart? For this crucial assignment, Germans provided Edward with their finest equipment: 2 cameras, a new wireless radio, a collection of poisons, a revolver, and £6,000 in cash. The investment demonstrated how seriously they regarded this intelligence-gathering operation. In the early hours of June 27, 1944, a lone Junkers aircraft flew over 6 Mile Bottom in the Cambridge Fens. Edward feared the plane might be shot down by British defenses before reaching the drop zone, adding another layer of danger to an already perilous mission. The parachute landing was again difficult windy conditions, and slight mist made navigation challenging. Edward landed hard on a country road between Cambridge and Newmarket, briefly losing consciousness from the impact. After recovering, he cut loose his parachute equipment and immediately sought out British authorities. Local police contacted MI5, who were prepared for Edward's return thanks to ultra-intercepts of German communications. Within 5 hours, he was having lunch with MI5 officers at the Naval and Military Club, led by his old handler, Colonel Tommy Robertson. But the reunion wasn't entirely celebratory. Not everyone at MI5 was pleased to see Agent Zigzag again. His new handler, Michael Ryde, regarded Edward as an encumbrance and embarrassment, making it his personal goal to remove him from British intelligence at the first opportunity. MI5 had already decided this mission would be Edward's last. He was considered too much of a loose cannon, with growing concerns that he might cause more trouble than his intelligence value justified. Nevertheless, his mission presented MI5 with a significant opportunity for strategic deception they couldn't resist. Knowing Germans lacked accurate ground reports about V1 effectiveness, British intelligence planned to use Edward for a sophisticated disinformation campaign. The strategy was to exaggerate V1 impacts in areas north and west of London while minimizing reports from south and east sections. The goal was brilliant in its simplicity: deceive Germans into shortening V1 range, diverting attacks away from heavily populated areas toward less critical targets. In his radio transmissions, Edward consistently indicated that bombs were overshooting their targets, landing in north and northeast London rather than the city center. The deception worked perfectly. Germans shortened their weapons range based on Edward's false reports, resulting in many bombs dropping harmlessly in farmland short of London. The operation undoubtedly saved thousands of civilian lives, making Edward Chapman's final mission his most humanitarian contribution to the war effort. By September 1st, the last V1 launch sites in northern France were overrun by advancing Allied forces. Approximately 5,500 people had been eliminated, and 16,000 seriously injured in the 12 weeks since attacks began. But double agents' efforts made the devastation far less catastrophic than Germany intended. As Paris was liberated in August 1944, Edward's indiscretions as an agent were becoming increasingly problematic for MI5. Success had gone to his head, and he couldn't stop talking about his achievements, creating security concerns that could compromise other operations. The end for Agent Zigzag was inevitable. In early November 1944, as Allied forces advanced toward Berlin and need for his services diminished, Edward Chapman was dropped by the Double Cross Committee. MI5 formally terminated Edward's employment as Agent Zigzag in November 1944, presenting him with a £6,000 payment equivalent to approximately £260,000 in today's currency. He was also granted a full pardon for his pre-war criminal activities. The terms were non-negotiable. His wartime activities fell under the British Official Secrets Act, meaning he could never publicly discuss his role in intelligence operations. The criminal-turned-spy had served his country with extraordinary courage and cunning, yet could tell no one about his contributions. The war's final months passed with Edward in strange limbo. Though no longer actively employed by MI5, he remained under surveillance. British intelligence monitored his movements and contacts, concerned about potential security breaches from a man who had never learned to keep secrets effectively. When victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, Edward celebrated alongside millions of his countrymen. But while others could share their war stories, his remarkable contributions remained classified. The Official Secrets Act created a prison more confining than any cell he'd occupied, the inability to claim credit for perhaps the most important work of his life. After the war, Edward reunited with Betty Farmer, the woman he'd been forced to abandon after his arrest in Jersey years earlier. Their relationship endured, despite intervening years and Edward's numerous other romantic entanglements. On October 9, 1947, they married quietly at Chelsea Registry Office. Edward published his first account, The Eddie Chapman Story, in 1954. This covered parts of his time in Germany, but necessarily omitted any mention of his work for MI5. The selective telling resulted in newspapers labeling him a traitor, accusations he couldn't publicly refute due to Official Secrets Act restrictions. His post-war life was characterized by material excess and varied business ventures. He owned a succession of yachts, drove a Rolls-Royce, and even purchased a steamer at one point. Together with Betty, he opened and operated several nightclubs and a health spa. But the line between Edward's legitimate business and criminality remained frustratingly blurry. He was linked to smuggling operations in Tangier and became embroiled in bizarre plots, including the pretend kidnapping of businessman Shiv Kapoor in the early 1960s. In 1966, Edward finally received permission to publish The Real Eddie Chapman Story, which revealed aspects of his double agent career. Public response was immediate and enthusiastic. Edward became a celebrity overnight, appearing on television and radio to discuss his exploits as Agent Zigzag. The book was subsequently adapted into a film titled Triple Cross, but Edward couldn't help reverting to criminality, becoming implicated in a Nigerian currency fraud scheme during the 1970s. As Edward aged, his legitimate business ventures crumbled and his health deteriorated markedly. Back pain that had plagued him since his wartime parachute jumps worsened progressively. A major stroke in the 1980s confined him to a wheelchair, and his final years were spent in a private nursing home near St. Albans. Despite being largely bedridden, he continued entertaining visitors with stories and irrepressible charm. On December 11, 1997, Edward Chapman passed away from heart failure at age 83, survived by wife Betty and daughters Diane and Suzanne. His passing attracted little public notice. The obituaries that appeared were generally complimentary, describing him as a brave man who had served his country despite unconventional methods and background. The full extent of Edward's wartime exploits remained classified until 2001, when his MI5 files were finally released to the UK National Archives. These documents, comprising over 1,700 pages, revealed previously secret details of his life as a double agent. While Edward Chapman received the Iron Cross from Germany, he received no official recognition from the country he ultimately served. Great Britain never acknowledged the contributions of the criminal who became a spy, the traitor who became an agent, and Agent Zigzag, who earned his place in the hidden history of Britain's finest hour. His story defies easy categorization, not one of pure heroism, but of human complexity. How the very qualities that make someone an outlaw in peacetime can make them invaluable during war. Yet for all his moral ambiguity, one fact remains undisputed. When his country needed him most, Edward Chapman answered the call. The safecracker became a spy, the criminal became an agent, and in the shadows between loyalty and betrayal, Agent Zigzag helped write history that would remain secret for decades after his passing.